In this video, we're going to talk about sequence and what sequences we look at on both the golf swing and the baseball swing. So sequence is, as defined, the order of events that our segments take throughout certain parts of the swing that we're looking at, right? So what's happening with my pelvis in relationship to my torso, in relationship to my upper arm, in relationship to my hand. It's not in terms of points in time in the swing, it's just in relationship to one another, right? So that's what we call sequence. So the first thing we're going to look at, we'll look at the golf side first. We look at three sequences when we talk about a golf swing. The takeaway sequence, the transition sequence, and the peak speed sequence. So the takeaway sequence is if I'm setting up to a golf ball, as I start my swing, what segments move in what order, okay? So in an ideal world, we want to see the hand move first, or the club move first, then the arm, then the torso, then the pelvis last. So that allows the player to what we call wind up properly and create stretch, which we'll get into in our stretch videos, throughout each segment of their body so that they can have a better opportunity to create some speed in the downswing, okay? The transition sequence is the sequence of events when we're changing directions from the backswing to the downswing. So now I've made my backswing, now I'm at the top, and what happens based upon when my hand reaches the top of its swing, did my pelvis change directions first like it should? So as I'm working my way up to the top, the pelvis should change directions first, then the torso, then the arm, then the hand. Okay, so we call this a 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence because pelvis is our first segment closest to the ground, then the torso, then the arm, then the hand. So we call that a 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence. So it's the opposite of what we look for in the takeaway. The takeaway, remember, we want 4, 3, 2, 1. So we wind up in the takeaway and we actually create more stretch in the transition, okay? And now the third sequence that we pay attention to in the golf swing is what we call the peak speed sequence. Peak speeds are referring to when each segment reaches its maximum rotational velocity in the downswing. So again, we want to see a 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence, meaning after I've changed directions, my pelvis reaches its peak speed first, then it starts to decelerate as my torso reaches its peak speed, then that starts to stabilize as my arm reaches its peak speed, and then finally that'll stabilize so that the hand can peak just prior to impact. So we'll talk about in the next video why some issues happen or what some issues could be that we commonly see when this gets out of order. But now on the baseball side, we want to see similar sequences, but we just don't have the takeaway sequence, right? So when a hitter in baseball is hitting, we don't have a backswing, obviously. So the first sequence would be the transition sequence that we talked about. And again, as that player's hitting, we want to see the pelvis start to go first, then we want to see the torso, then we want to see the arm transition, and then finally the hand. And then again, the peak speed order. In the most efficient example, even though we'll talk about some idiosyncrasies, the most efficient example is still a 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want to see the pelvis peak, then we want to see that stabilize, torso peak, then that stabilizes, arm peak, and then hand peak just before the baseball player makes contact with the ball. So remember, these sequences are important because it gives the player opportunity to create more speed through their body and transfer that energy from segment to segment. Look for next week's video where we'll talk about what issues can arise if your player has a bad sequence in their golf or baseball swings.